So good afternoon, everybody. And, oh, there we go. And good afternoon even to the clicker. For those of you visiting the Blavatnik School of Government for the first time, a huge welcome. And for those of you who live here, it's lovely to have you here. This is we're delighted to be hosting for the first time an event by Torch. Torch is a very special centre of research in the humanities at Oxford. And I'm Ngaire Woods, I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government. And so it's a special pleasure to host it for the Centre for Research in the Humanities and to introduce to you their first, I think, Global South visiting fellow, Nur Laiq. Nur has been active she's a practitioner of policy and has been active drafting policy in India, in the United States, in the United Kingdom. She's come up close to populism, which is the topic of today's discussion. And Nur will formally introduce Andrés Velasco, but given our friendship and his association with this school, I just want to say a word about Andrés. Andrés has been part of the Blavatnik School of Government since the very early days of designing the school, long before it existed, when Andrés would come to Oxford and brainstorm with us and bring the wisdom that he had, having been finance minister, having been part of Harvard's School of Government, having run for elections in Chile. He brought all of that experience to the school. So just in a special personal note of welcome, Andrés, we hope this school always feels a little bit like home to you. And I'll let Nur introduce you properly. But welcome and thank you all.
Thank you, Ngaire. I'm thrilled that Andrés was with us. And I'm particularly delighted to be having this discussion here at the Blavatnik. My home at Oxford is Torch, as Ngaire mentioned, and it's just across the backyard from here. But Blavatnik has been like a second home for me here because of all the policy discussions I've been attending. I met Andrés in Delhi not all that long ago, but I actually knew of Andrés during his tenure as finance minister back in the 2000s. I thought of him as someone who had not succumbed to the temptations of populism. This, despite immense pressure to spend the income generated by Chile's copper windfall at the time. I think I saw that Foreign Policy magazine described it as having the courage to put away the fiscal punch bowl before the crowd had drunk its fill. The decision later turned him into a sort of white knight when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, and Chile was then able to use its copper savings to fund a large stimulus package. This is the first reason that I thought who better to have come and speak on this most pressing issue of our time on populism than Andrés. But I also have a second reason, just in case being a prudent and responsible politician isn't enough in this populist era. The second reason is that in addition to the political perspective that Andrés obviously brings, he also brings an academic perspective and a writer's perspective. Andrés has written two novels, one, in fact, rather serendipitously called Vox Populi. And I believe that a writer, in fact, is possibly even more of an astute observer than a politician, or dare I say, than an academic, of people's anxieties and aspirations and of their sense of identity. So again, who better to come and talk about the combustible power of identity and politics, and about the populist predicament than Andrés. In terms of just a bit more of a formal introduction, a couple of more lines. So Andrés was a presidential candidate as well as finance minister of Chile. He is the dean of the School of Public Policy at the LSE and has written numerous books and papers on international economics and development, and has also held faculty positions at Harvard, Columbia, and New York universities. Just in terms of the program today, we'll have Andrés talk for about 25 minutes, and then we wanted this to be as interactive a discussion as possible. So it'll be opened up for question and answers with the audience. So Andrés, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much for those two exceedingly kind and generous introductions. My colleagues at the LSE last night were making fun of me, saying, "What in the world are you going to do visiting the competition?" But after that welcome, I am reassured that I did the right thing, that I've come to the right place, and it is, of course, a delight to be here. As we were walking in, I was reminding Ngaire that I had the privilege of being part of the meeting at which the original design, the maquette for this building, was unveiled. I was among the people cheering on, thinking it was a great design. Not everybody around the table thought so, but good sense prevailed, and we have this lovely building, and we have, of course, Ngaire's extraordinary leadership of the school, from which I have learned and hope to learn much more as I try to lead a school that, started about 7 or 8 years after this one, so we have a bit of catching up to do, but in terms of horse racing, I am sure we will catch up to you and get to the finish line before at some point, whatever that finish line might be. All right, I am here to talk about populism. Once upon a time when I spoke about populism to audiences in Europe or the US or the UK, I always felt that I was bringing some foreign subject to the nice, pure domains of rich country politics. But of course, the world has changed. I've been living in the United Kingdom for about a year now, and I have found that whenever I'm invited to a nice, polite English dinner, and the host asks me, how are you settling in England? There's one answer I can provide that will make the host feel uncomfortable. I reply, well, I am from Latin America, which is, of course, the place where populism comes from. And now I'm in the United Kingdom, which is also the site of political populism. So thank you very much. I feel right at home. That is a way of making the host of hostess sort of squirm in their chair. But it also happens to be true. Now, where's my clicker? Here it is. The title that Nur provided for my talk is much better than this title, so I will stick to her title. Let's call this The Temptations of Populism. So these people you all know. I don't have to provide any introductions to any one of them. I just want to highlight the fact that it is not obvious as you look at that set of pictures what these people have in common. Some are men, some are women, some are of the political right, some are of the political left. Some govern rich countries, some govern poor countries, some govern middle-class countries. Some are alive, some are dead, although the current president of Venezuela claims that Chavez speaks to him through a little bird, so maybe he's not entirely dead. So what do these people have in common? Why am I putting up their pictures in the same slide? And that's, of course, the obvious answer. An answer which I want to defend, because I'm sure that as soon as I say that, many of you might be thinking, what the hell is a populist? What these people have in common? What do you mean by populism? Isn't that too broad a category, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I am aware of those complaints. I am keenly aware of those objections, and I want to argue that, yes, populism is a useful category for thinking about politics if we define it in the proper way. And that's what I want to do in the next few minutes. I said this already, but let me emphasize it. If my part of the world had collected royalties on populism, we would be richer than Dubai. Regrettably, this is not the sort of thing you can patent and then, keep the cash coming. But, I'm sure you know who these gentlemen are. The guy on the left is Perón, who ran Argentina beginning in 1946. The gentleman in the middle is a guy called Getulio Vargas, who ran Brazil many times, beginning in the 1930s as well. And the guy on the right is Lázaro Cárdenas, who was the president of Mexico also in the 1930s, and who, among other things, nationalized oil in Mexico. If you were to award a copyright for political populism and economic populism, these guys would get the copyright. And of course, their countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, would be among the leading lights, the founding land of populism. Now, let me make a plug for the LSE. As I was researching populism around the world, I came across a book in the library that dates back to 1968. It is a conference held at the LSE with a bunch of papers on the rise of populism, 1968, mind you, okay? The introduction begins like this. It says, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of populism. So, first point, it's always nice to paraphrase Marx and Engels. Second point, we have had many waves of populism. 1935 or 32 in Latin America may have been one. Arguably the 60s in the US and the UK, at least with the authors of this book, were also a time of populism. And I want to argue that today you can make that case as well. The numbers are big. This is kind of a back of the envelope, a Mickey Mouse accounting of the number of people living under regimes that you might call populist. And needless to say, I'm sure there are people from all of these countries in the room, and somebody will raise his hand or her hand and say, oh, that's not fair, my leader is not populist. But sort of back of the envelope, if you accept my definition, and I will give you a formal definition in a minute, that's about 2.4 billion people. That's over a third of humanity. So that's, nearly a third of humanity. That's a lot of people. In case you're wondering where the 170 million came from in Europe, that's from a piece that tried to compute the number of people who live in countries in the European Union in which at least one party in the governing coalition can be called a populist party, okay? Not every party in that coalition need be that. Now, let's dig a little deeper. In my part of the world, Latin America, the traditional definition of populism is all about economics. And it's what Mr. Perón and Mr. Vargas and Mr. Cárdenas pioneered, but of course we've been doing it ever since, and if you look at, say, Venezuela today, it is an extreme, in this case, extreme and tragic case of that. It is an economic policy in which you spend too much, you tax too little, you borrow too much, you acquire lots of liabilities, and eventually things blow up. Maybe because of a balance of payments crisis, you run out of foreign exchange, maybe because of an inflation crisis, maybe because of a banking crisis, maybe because of all the above together. As it happened to Venezuela a couple of years ago, still ongoing, as it happened to Argentina last year, the examples are many. I want to argue that this is not necessarily the most common, and certainly not necessarily the most interesting and most worrisome kind of populism. I worry more about what I'm going to call political populism. And I want to argue that you can be a political populist without necessarily being an economic populist. Because we are at a university, before simply asserting things, one has to have a serious academic reference. This is my serious academic reference. It's a very famous book by Rudi Dormisch, the late German economist at MIT, and a guy called Sebastian Edwards at UCLA. They wrote a big book on populism. This is what they said, economic populism is what I just said, basically, an approach to economic policy which eventually fails or ultimately fails, not because conservative economics is better, but because the policies are unsustainable. This is not dead. Again, Venezuela is sort of the ultimate case of this. But I want to argue that today you can be a populist without doing this sort of thing. If anything, there are some leaders around the world. Mr. Morales in Bolivia may be one, Mr. Orban in Hungary may be another, who are populist in the political sense of the term, but who need not be populist in the economic sense of the term. If anything, some of these populist leaders are following fairly orthodox economic policies. Some of you may like orthodox economic policies, some of you may dislike orthodox economic policies, but I don't see Orban in Hungary or Kaczynski in Poland or Morales in Bolivia about to be ejected from office because of a big balance of payments crisis or a big banking crisis or a big debt crisis. I could eat my words, of course. In the current world, these things happen very unexpectedly, so maybe, but given what I know about policies and data today, that does not seem like a very likely outcome. So you can be a political populist without being an economic populist in the classic Latin American sense. There are lots of questions as to why people pursue economic populism, and given that Nur gave me a very tight time constraint, I do not want to dwell on them. I just want to say that to social science, to economists, sociologists, political scientists, it remains less than evident why it is that people pursue policies which involve a lot of gain for today at the expense of a lot of pain for tomorrow. And there's a budding literature in the academic world. It's been budding for, for about 25 years, so it's not really a bud anymore. It's a big leaf. I contributed to some of it, in which people try to explain why these policies may occur in reality, or as an economist might say, in equilibrium. The only point that I want to highlight here is that there's a current line of argumentation pioneered by people like, Daron Acemoglu, the great Turkish economist at MIT, or a friend of mine at Harvard, a guy called Rafael Di Tella from Argentina, who claim that to understand these kinds of policies, the concept of identity may be important. And I want to highlight identity because I'm going to return to identity later on. In particular, and I'm going to give you a one-line Mickey Mouse version of the kinds of things that they talk about. If you live in a country in which the credibility of a political class is suspect, maybe because politicians historically have been in the pocket of powerful interests, business groups, people who, pay for your campaigns, etc. Well, one way you dispel that credibility problem is that you lean very far to the left, because that's the way you make people believe that you're in fact not in the pocket of some evil capitalist. Is there a cost to this? Yes, there is a cost to this, but it may be the only and efficient but only way of solving this legitimacy/credibility problem. I want to leave it at that. Those two papers that I cite there are fascinating. You may want to look at them, but I want to move on. So let me now get to the core of the matter, because I've been waving my hands and saying there is such an animal as political populism, but I have not told you what that is and why it is an interesting and useful category for thinking about the world. And I want to argue, and I'm going to draw, this is mostly my own work, but I want to draw from a guy whose work I like a lot, a guy called Hans Werner Miller, who's a German political scientist at Princeton in the US. He has a lovely book called What is Populism? It's short and sweet and reads very quickly. If I can make one reading recommendation, go and buy it. I'm sure Ngaire has recommended it already. I think it is one of the better books on populism. I want to argue, and this is not pure Miller. In fact, Miller would probably not recognize his baby if he saw it. I want to argue that political populism is an approach, a style, a way of doing politics which has three components. A no to complexity, a no to pluralism, and often, not always, but often enough to be worried or worrisome, a no to democratic checks and balances. And let me illustrate each one of those. We are at a public policy school within one of the world's great universities. Public policy schools and great universities are in the business of complexity. We think the world is really complicated. We want to understand it better, so we pack our bags, in Beijing or Kuala Lumpur or Rio de Janeiro or Mexico City, and we come to London or the LSE or Oxford and study with Ngaire and try to understand the complexity of the world. And the first thing the teachers at the school, correct me if I'm wrong, will tell you is that complex problems require complex theories and in turn give rise to complex policy solutions, right? It is very seldom that a one-liner of a policy solution is the right answer to a complex problem. Is this what we're seeing in the world today? Clearly not. My test case, of course, is Mr. Trump, who is not necessarily the most likable kind of fellow, but he is indeed a very skilled politician. And it is hard to think of a better slogan for a campaign than simply say, in response to the massively complex issue of immigration, build a wall. We all know that migration flows depend on climate change, on warfare, on economic, political, and cultural variables. It is a big, complex, messy thing. Trump says, dispense with the complexity, simply build a wall. I realized what a brilliant line that was when I walked into my house about 3 years ago, and I have a son who's 9 now. He was 6 back then, but he knew how to operate my computer and YouTube already, and he had discovered a video on YouTube which invited children to play a game called build a wall. So my son had secured a bunch of, wooden blocks, and on the living room rug, he was building a wall to keep evil people out. As a practicing politician, I have worked on many campaigns, including my own. I have recruited some of the leading lights in political advertisements in my country, and we never came up with a slogan that a child who's 6 across the world would have been aware of and keen to think about. We came up with slogans for my campaigns that my mother was aware of and a few family friends, but not necessarily that had that kind of reach. What is the problem with this? Well, the problem is, of course, that the world is complex and we need complex policy answers. Ralph Dahrendorf, another LSE plug, a political scientist and sociologist who used to be the director of the LSE 30, 40 years ago, in that book that I just mentioned, the 1968 volume, said, if you want to, make it short and sweet, I'll make it short and sweet. Democracy is complex. Populism is simple. Or H.L. Mencken, the great American essayist, once said, I'm going to read it because I want to get it right, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And we today live in a world in which, partially also because of Twitter and Facebook and all that stuff, the answers that get placed in the midst of our discussions are often clear, simple, and wrong. This, of course, among other consequences, has the consequence that expertise is devalued. Because, if the world is simple, why the hell do they need people like us, who've paid Oxford a few £1,000s, actually more than a few £1,000s, to tell them that the world is complex? So I will return to this issue in a minute, but the devaluation of expertise, the devaluation of expert knowledge as an input into the democratic process is also an upshot of this. So that's category number one, or characteristic number one of populistic politics. Characteristic number two is a consequence of number one. Because if you think that the world is simple, well, the answer is simple. Too many migrants, build a wall. Too many criminals, shoot the criminals. That's what Bolsonaro in Brazil said when he was running for office. And therefore, anybody else with any other view can be up to no good. Because if clearly the only answer is build a wall, and there's some other person saying, oh no, I have a 10-point plan to deal with that, well, that person could not be animated by the common good, could not be a legitimate participant in our common debate, because the answer is obvious, build a wall. And as a result, pluralism, which is not only the acceptance of many views, but the acceptance of the legitimacy of the other views in the course of a democratic dialogue, pluralism under populism goes out the window. In the New Yorker recently, there was an article in which they quoted the man who trained Steve Bannon, who in turn trained Donald Trump. And this very experienced, very seasoned New York political consultant said, in every election today, the following scenario plays out. There's one candidate who says, I have a 10-point plan to deal with this problem. And there's another candidate who says, they're all thieves, they're all crooks, kick them all out. Guess who wins? The person with a 10-point plan never wins. Ask Hillary Clinton, right? Now, there are different kinds of denials of pluralism because there are different kinds of enemy creation. One useful distinction, and this is not mine, this is due to a guy called John Juddis, an American journalist and historian. Juddis says, look, if you deny pluralism, well, the guy with the other view must be up to no good, but there are two kinds of enemies that arise from this approach. Left-wing populism says, well, clearly the bad guys are the elite. And there is a nice, well-meaning, immaculate people that is always right, and there is some elite that is always wrong. This is the kind of rhetoric you get from, say, Chavez or Maduro in Venezuela. You get it from AMLO, the president of Mexico today, and certainly they're not the only ones. If you're a right-wing populist, going after the elite is kind of hard because you may belong to it, i.e. Donald Trump, or i.e. I was going to say the current Prime Minister of the UK, but I will be careful on that. Right-wing populism finds some other player, some other agent, some other group whose opinions can be easily disqualified and viewed as illegitimate, and that other group, of course, is a minority, whether it's immigrants or an ethnic or a racial or a religious or a sexual minority. And as a result, left-wing populism, Judith calls dyadic. There are two groups, one good, one bad. Right-wing populism typically involves three groups. There's some elite, there's some people, and there's these other guys who are evil, and the other guys who are evil are the ones whose rights to speak up are denied by this denial of pluralism. Last but not least, if you believe the other two, the consequence is, pretty easy to arrive at. If the world is simple, other views are not legitimate, pluralism is out the window, well, why have the checks and balances and constraints and niceties that are so essential to liberal democracy? Liberal democracy is not just any kind of democracy, right? At the risk of offending political science professors in the room who know much more than I on this subject, one simple way to make the distinction is democracy is majority rule. Liberal democracy is majority rule with a bunch of checks and balances to make sure that the majority does not run roughshod over the rights of the minority or the minorities. So liberal democracy is all about freedom of the press. It's about division of powers, about checks and balances, Supreme Courts, constitutional courts, transparency, accountability, etc., etc., etc. It is not always the case, but it is often the case that once you've denied pluralism, that is to say, once you've told the other guy or the other person or the other woman that her view is not legitimate, well, that person's political rights also go out the window. And to different degrees, we've seen that in, say, Nicaragua and Venezuela, in my part of the world, which today are pretty much outright dictatorships. And you've seen it in a somewhat lessened form in Hungary, but a very dangerous form as well in Hungary and Poland. You've seen it in Turkey. You've seen it in the Philippines. And the list keeps going on and on. So populism often, not always, but often leads to an erosion of democratic rights. And I want to say this, and I want to emphasize this, because often in the popular press or in some quarters, populism is viewed as a nice sort of alternative to the democratic failings that are so common today. So if democracy is imperfect, if democracy is captured, a little doses of populism will make people wake up, will shake up things a bit, and you'll get a better democracy. I want to argue that that is not right. In fact, populism is often a threat to democracy, not a cure for the ills or the diseases that might affect contemporary democracy. Now, if you believe the story that I've been telling, there are at least two implications that I want to highlight. One is divisive speech. Politics has become very nasty, which as a social scientist is a little bit puzzling, because a naive view might say, well, in democratic politics, you need to win an election. If you're going to win an election, you need most people. And if you need most people to go, get up in the morning, stand in line, and vote for you, well, you want to be nice to them. And historically successful politicians are people who brought people together with a speech that was inclusive, not divisive. On the contrary, today, more often than not, political speech is very divisive. Orban, and I will not read every single one of those quotes, Orban in that quote rediscovers what it is 99.9% classic European 1930s anti-Semitic rhetoric. I mean, textbook anti-Semitism. Mr. Bolsonaro said, and this is quite literally a quote, that he hopes that criminals will die in the street like cockroaches. And Mr. Duterte in the Philippines, when asked what he thought of a gathering of feminists, said, oh, they're just a bunch of crazy women. Okay? This is not Nelson Mandela at work here, right? This is not Barack Obama. The big tent under which, there's room for all of us. That kind of politics is not entirely gone, but it is certainly under siege. So I think an interesting question is, why do we get this kind of divisive speech if you might think naively that you need a group as large as possible to vote for you, and as a result, this kind of thing would be counterproductive. Now the other thing that I want to highlight, but I said it already, is the big attack on expert knowledge. And let me say one more thing about that before moving on. Ngaire is the Dean of a School of Public Policy. I am the Dean of a School of Public Policy. We are in the business of producing people who will be experts. And Michael Gove told us 2 years ago that Britain is tired of experts. So as I was coming to the UK with my family and my dog, I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to produce more experts. I'm going to enlarge the supply of experts at a time when the demand for experts seemed to be collapsing. So the economist in me thought, oh no, the wages of those experts will be going down. But not simply the wages, right? I think it's a very big issue, which raises questions as to what kind of training do we provide students at institutions like the Blavatnik School or the LSE School of Public Policy. What is it about the nature of expert knowledge that makes it so controversial today? Why is it so devalued? And how could we put it back where, in my view at least, it rightfully belongs? I will not say anything more about that now, but I think it is a fascinating subject for discussion. Now, let me now get more controversial. How am I doing for time? I'm probably out of time already, but let me spend another 5 minutes or so and I will relinquish the microphone. She's very forceful. She will take the microphone away from me when the time comes. So why is this all happening? The conventional wisdom is very simple. Conventional wisdom is, well, the world has become really unequal. In countries like the US and the UK, the economy has been growing, but wages have been stagnating. The distribution of income has become worse. And of course, you had this big outrageous thing called the world financial crisis, in which central banks bail out bankers and their bonuses, and middle-class people lost their homes, lost their jobs, lost their incomes. And as a result, if you believe that, well, the explanation of populism is the economy. Carville, the guy who used to run Bill Clinton's campaign, used to repeat, it's the economy stupid. In this case, it is also the economy stupid. The policy implication is that this is all about economics. You fix the economy, you make the income distribution somewhat less bad, you provide more fairness, better jobs, you make the dynamics of distribution less ugly, and then populism will go away. I want to argue, quoting Mr. Mencken, that line of argumentation is sexy, appealing, simple, and wrong. And it is wrong for the reasons that I will now try to explain. Let me get empirical on you for a minute. I think there are 3 empirical reasons why that line of argumentation is not very convincing. The first one is that it is mostly built for the US and the UK. It is a North Atlantic view of the world. It is in the US and the UK that the median wage has stagnated, that the middle class has been hollowed out, that the income distribution has become much worse. That's not necessarily true of Germany or Sweden. It's certainly not true of Argentina or Turkey. But even in the US and the UK, if you look at the academic literature that tries to sort out who is it that voted for Brexit, who is it that voted for Trump, it is not clear that economic variables really have the upper hand in explaining that phenomenon. In my office at the LSE, on my floor, there's a guy who's probably the leading expert in the United Kingdom on these matters. So I said to him, what are the 2 most influential papers in this area? He said, read those 2. And here are the titles. One, this is on the US. One is called Status Threat, Not Economic Hardship, Explains the 2016 Presidential Vote. And the other one is called Vote Switching in the 2016 Election, How Racial and Immigration Attitudes, Not Economics, Explains the Shifts in White Voting. So bottom line, not even for the US and the UK is this hypothesis well-grounded empirically. I'm sure there are other papers that say something different, but at least the horse race is still going on and the outcome is not clear. Secondly, we have to avoid the temptation of viewing the world exclusively through the lens of what happens in the North Atlantic. If you look at the rest of the world, what is striking about many of these countries in which population is taking hold is not how bad the economic performance has been, but how good the economic performance has been. Turkey and the Philippines, 2 poster children for this kind of populism. Well, since the world financial crisis, the economies in both of these countries have been growing on average at nearly 7%, 6.9 and 6.8. And if you look at real wages, if you look at the median wage, if you look at any variable of economic performance, including income distribution, in fact, most people, if not everybody in these economies, is living better. In Brazil had a big recession. Economic performance has not been great. But let us not forget that until about a couple of years ago, Lula and the Brazilian government were being touted as the guys who had found the key to redistribute income. Barack Obama once said that Lula was the most popular politician on earth. This is, of course, before Lula went to jail. He's still a very popular politician, even in jail. And the reason for his popularity was that presumably he had done more than anybody else to right the wrongs of a very unequal income distribution in Brazil. So even in Brazil, there's a country with a mediocre economic performance, there are grounds to argue that it is not clear that economics is behind populism. Last but not least, if economic stagnation, wage compression, and inequality were the causes of populism, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that we would be seeing a very big surge in left-wing populism. And in fact, what we're seeing in the world is mostly a surge in right-wing populism. And therefore, the sort of causal relationship between inequality and populism is, in my view, if you take these three factors together, very much brought into question. More conceptually, even if I believe that there is some causal connection between economic shocks and political outcomes, it is pretty clear these are mediated by things that you might call beliefs. We're going to view inequality very differently if we think that inequality is deserved or undeserved. There are people who are filthy rich, either football players or, the Bill Gateses and Steve Jobs of the world. But nobody in Brazil or in Italy or in any football-crazed country marches up and down the street to complain that the great football players are paid, 100 million pounds a year, right? So whether we think equality is a good or a bad thing, or inequality is a good or bad thing, hinges very crucially on who the people are who are getting the money and whether we believe they deserve it or not. Clearly, in a racially divided society, if I belong to one group and the other people are getting rich, I'm going to think this inequality is very bad. If I belong to a certain group and my people are getting rich, I'm not going to feel exactly the same way. And as a result, at least we need a theory of mediation. At least we need an account of how the economic shocks get translated into attitudes, and then they get translated into political variables. And this simple account simply does not provide for that. So let me just get to the punchline of what I want to say. I think that it is very, very, very hard, and of course I'm not the first person to say this, but I've been writing and developing arguments in this line along with several others. It is very hard to understand what's been going on in the world without appealing to the concept of identity. I'm an economist, so I was trained, when I did my PhD, to believe that there's no such thing as identity. People have preferences, utility functions, stuff like that, but what the hell is an identity? But in the years since, we economists have, we've atoned for some of our sins, not all of our sins, and to some extent, economists have begun to accept that there is such a thing as an identity. I learned that there was an identity when, of course, I went into politics. I had been a minister of finance of Chile for about 6 months. Christmas came, and I held a little cocktail party at my house with all the parliamentarians in the Senate and House finance committees who belonged to my coalition, to thank these wonderful men and women for all the good work that we had done. And so when the toast time came, I raised my glass and I said, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank everybody in this room for the fact that we passed, I'm going to make this up, 37 bills last year, high-quality legislation, and this is where I made my crucial mistake, I want to remind you that 25 of those were passed with the support of the opposition, which means that there were such good bills that, even these people on the other side of the aisle voted for them. So I toast to that, and I raised my glass, and no one in the room said anything. And there was a long, very, very, very uncomfortable silence until a very senior senator with many more gray hairs than I said, Minister, with all due respect, you don't quite get it, do you? And I said, no, Senator, clearly not. Please tell me what I should be getting. And I said, you seem to think that passing bills with the support of the opposition is an achievement. We think it's a disgrace because when we do, they get the credit. We don't appear in the press. So please, we will raise our glasses if you make the following vow. Next year, Minister, please bring to us lots of bills that will never get through, but where we can underscore our differences with these evil guys on the other side of the aisle, because that way we reassert our identity, we make it to the press, we energize our troops, and we get reelected, okay? Consensus, high-quality bills, you know, technical thinking, all that stuff that I'm sure professors in this building tell you about. We needed red meat. We needed a fight with the opposition. We needed to reassert who we were. We were this party, not the other party, this coalition, not the other coalition. Now, identity, of course, you know, has been around for a very long time, but one person who's been arguing that identity has become particularly tricky and important and pivotal recently is a man called Yasha Monk, who's a young political scientist at Harvard. Yasha says, well, part of the problem is that historically, democracy thrived in countries which were homogeneous and had very narrow shared identities, say the Northern European countries, or in countries that were large and diverse like the US, but which spent a lot of time and money and effort trying to build a common identity. If you're a migrant to the US, which I was at age 15, you know, the first thing that you experience is that they shove you into a civics class and, you know, you learn to be an American and they tell you about the American Constitution and all of that. And there are people at the LSE who've done research on how America built this shared identity. And, you know, they spent a lot of money and a lot of effort back in, say, the 1920s and 30s doing this. What's the problem, of course, that today in the world, identities are many, countries are much more diverse, and this happens in a context of democratic competition. This is new. This has not been happening historically, and this places new stress on democracy. I have a more technical part of this talk that I'm going to skip in the interest of time. I just simply want to tell you, and I'm going to make a bold assertion, and then I will move on, that these claims that I've made in a way that may strike some of you as a little too fast and a little too loose, you know, if you're a social scientist and you want to see evidence and you want to see a model and you want to see equations and all of that, I could make that case, you know, if Nur were to give me another 45 minutes, which she won't. You know, there are ways of thinking systematically about the role of identity. There are ways of, if you're an economist or if you like models, there are ways of modeling identity in the context of a serious formal model. The guy who began doing this, of course, is the great George Akerlof, Nobel Prize winner. But the only idea that I want to leave with you is that, you know, your sense of self, your identity, is absolutely key to this. And one of the things that you can get out of this academic modeling effort is that, in fact, you find situations in which things like a devaluation of expertise and things like divisive speech, in fact, emerge in equilibrium. That is to say, they are the outcome of a society which endogenously splits into competing identities. And if the other group has a different identity than mine, well, I will have second thoughts about listening to experts. Maybe they are from the other group. And of course, I will have second thoughts about being nice to the other guys because I'm in a competition with them, either an identity competition, an electoral competition, or both. And, you know, I have some equations to show you, whatever. I will return back to that if somebody would like me to. Let me begin to wrap it up so that we can have a discussion. I didn't fully make my case for identity, but hopefully my anecdote conveyed sort of the gist of what I want to say. As I look at phenomena across the world, from English nationalism to Hindu nationalism, we were talking about that at lunch, to Islamic fundamentalism, to Catalonian separatism, to Brexit, to the recent protests and looting in my country, Chile, I find it very hard to think about any of those items without reaching out into the cabinet and putting identity into the picture. And I think identity, politics in a very fundamental way, is behind the surge of populism. It is not simply bad economics, it is much more than that. This being a school of public policy, somebody might say, okay, fine, but what are the policy implications? And that would, you know, that's a very big question. I don't have a very big answer to that. But let me suggest one idea, because I could simply leave you here feeling all depressed. I want to leave you feeling all cheerful. So let me, you know, put on the table one parting thought, which is of a more cheerful nature. I've been nasty toward economists, I've been nasty toward political scientists, I've been nasty toward, no, I haven't been nasty, but I've been critical of a few people. I think what is really in short supply today, aside from good economists and good social scientists, is very good politicians. Because what a good politician does, a great politician, a genius of a politician, is he or she builds an identity for a society which transcends the local, individual, narrow, tribal identities. The key thing, of course, is that you want to do that on the basis of signals and values and symbols which are inclusive rather than exclusive. Nationalism was always an easy way, an easy thing to apply to, or to bring into the picture, and that's why English nationalism or Hindu nationalism is today very much in vogue. But the real challenge is to go beyond that and to think about building shared identities in large, diverse, ethnically and culturally mixed nation states which bring everybody in as opposed to leaving somebody out. There's a beautiful book, my second reading recommendation, by an American political philosopher, a woman called Martha Nussbaum. The book is called Political Emotions, in which she describes, much better than I ever could, how some of the great political leaders in history, Gandhi and Nehru in India, Lincoln in the United States are two examples, or Martin Luther King in the US, how they built this inclusive identity, which in my view is the key antidote to populism. I think that the two politicians in the world today who understand this and who are trying to do this, whether they are succeeding or failing, as they say in the US, I will take the fifth on that. One is Justin Trudeau in Canada, and the other one is Emmanuel Macron in France. I used to think that, oh my God, my argument is going to go down the drain because Trudeau will not get reelected. Well, he's back in office, leading a minority government, but leading a government nonetheless. I find, go read Trudeau's speeches about what it means to be a Canadian. On the one hand, it is a very nationalistic speech. It is all about what it means to be a Canadian. But to me, what it means to be a Canadian, if you believe Trudeau, is not about being a Christian or about being white or about being French or being Anglo-Saxon. No, it is all about upholding those values that have made Canada what it is today. And of course, those values are inclusiveness and an openness to migration, because Canada has a higher share of migrants in the population than practically any other country in the world. If you listen to Macron, he's also a nationalist. He's a French nationalist. Boris Johnson has learned that recently. But he's not saying that being French is all about being Christian or white or Gallic. He's saying that being French is about being an heir to those great values of fraternity, liberty, equality, so on and so forth. So I would like to think that the real task, and this will be my homework to all the Blavatnik schools in the room, is how do we think about a politics today which fights populism not with the tools of populism, but with the tools of the right identity, an identity which is broad enough to encompass everybody and which is appealing enough to be, or intelligent enough or humane enough to be based on common values. That, of course, is a great thing to say. It is very hard to do, and I'm hoping some people in the room will take the torch and run with it. Thank you very much.
Should we sit down?
Sure.
So we can...
If my watch is right, we have over half an hour for discussion, so
Yes.
I didn't do too badly.
Thank you so much for such a rich talk, and I would have loved to have given you more time to expand on things, but actually there was popular demand for direct interaction with you.
Please.
So before I open it up to the audience for questions, I have to ask, given everything that's been happening this week in Chile, a question about what's happening in your own country. The Financial Times and the New York Times have all painted it, the protests that have been taking place, as something that has been decades in the making and a story of inequality. You had an article come out yesterday evening where you say that's not quite right. It's not just about inequality, because in fact, the levels of disparity have fallen since 1990. And so inequality is actually, there's less inequality than before. You also say that you're slightly concerned because in Chile already polls are showing that there have been gains for populists on the extreme left and on the extreme right. So just sort of 1.5 questions, which is where do you think the divergence is in terms of people who are supporting the extreme right and the extreme left in terms of populists. And also to go back to your article, you say that this is a unique opportunity for to come up with a new social contract for the country. Mm-hmm. So could you give us your manifesto, the 10-point plan or the 1-point plan?
Oh my God. Well, let me begin by saying that I have spent the last week and a half not doing a lot of work for the LSE because I've been gripped like every other Chilean has been by what came as quite a shock. And anybody who says that it was not surprising, that it was not a shock, he or she is lying, because we didn't see this coming. Nobody saw this coming. I wrote a rather longish piece in Project Syndicate, which I invite you to read. I don't want to repeat everything that I said there. I tried to play a slight contrarian in one dimension. In some sense, clearly, Chile is a very unfair and unequal society, and people who feel treated and people who feel that they live in a very nice, well-meaning society don't loot and don't riot. So inequality of some kind must be behind this. That's undeniable. But the hard question is, what kind of inequality? And why is it causing the kinds of behavior that we're seeing? That's a much harder question. And again, it's a question that we should try to answer going beyond slogans. It's not simply, build a wall or don't build a wall, because I think it is too easy to fall into that. Clearly, back of the envelope income inequality, as in the Gini coefficient for the experts in the room, that can't be it, because the Gini coefficient is still high, but it's been falling by leaps and bounds in Chile. Real wages have been rising, inflation is very low, and so, if the proverbial Martian were to get off, the space saucer and look at Chile, the first set of statistics would not suggest that this sort of thing was incubating. I think there are other particular kinds of inequalities and other particular kinds of triggers for anger that have happened, which don't necessarily fall under the category of income inequality. I'll give you three. Chile has a pensions problem, and it has a pensions problem largely because of a developmental success. We have a pensions system that was built for a country in which people retired at 60 and died at 70, and today people retire at 60 and they live until 90. In addition to that, it is an individual account system, so the return on your assets matters a lot. And so when you save and the interest rate is very high, you make a lot of money and you retire with a good pension. People in this room will all know that the rate of interest on assets in the world has been collapsing, right? We have negative interest rates for a lot of investments today in the world. So the combination of huge longevity on the one hand and a collapse in return on the other makes this system of pensions very, very hard to manage. And yes, there are a lot of people, not necessarily the poorest, because the poorest have a government-provided minimum pension guarantee, which I have put together when I was minister. It is the middle class that is really feeling the pinch. So there is an issue of human suffering. Yes, there is an issue of legitimate human annoyance. Yes. Is that a back-of-the-envelope inequality story? Not necessarily. The other issue, I think, is political. The Chilean political class, was viewed in a very positive light when, we disposed of a dictator 30 years ago by fairly peaceful means. But that rather, respected and I was even going to say beloved political class of 30 years ago is today a political class that nobody trusts very much, to some extent because it became insular, to some extent because the re-election rates of incumbents are very high. So it's, as a nephew of mine puts it to me, I turn on the TV and it's the same guy, so, again and again and again and again and again. There have been lots of scandals of one kind or another, many of them very nasty. So I think a very big issue today is political. Maybe, I was talking about mediation of economic shocks and political outcomes. You may be more tolerant or less tolerant of low wages or of slow growth if you think that the politicians in charge are at least doing a decent job. And if you think that they're working for you as opposed to working for themselves. And I think it is that particular trigger that has been at work in Chile. Let me say one last thing. There's inequality of income or there's inequality of access. Where Chile falls very, 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 very short is that it remains a very conservative and old-fashioned society, and the kinds of discrimination in the labor market that have to do with, you go to a job interview and people don't ask you were your grades good. People ask you, what neighborhood do you live in, or what secondary school did you go to, or, are you the nephew of so-and-so? And that is a very big source of frustration. As many more working class people get to university, they're very proud of the university degrees. They're the first people in their family who have university degrees. They go into the labor market and they find out all the plum jobs and go to people with the right surname who went to the right school. And that's a fairly new phenomenon, but a very divisive and very explosive phenomenon. So yes, there is something brewing in Chile. Now, is there an opportunity to right the wrongs? I think there is. I mean, it's a political opportunity. The old cliche is that a crisis is an opportunity we should not waste. This is certainly a crisis, so there's a political opportunity. But there are also big risks. The big risk, of course, is that when you have division and when you have fear, the populists come riding into the set. And we're beginning to see that. There are a number of polls that happened before this crisis, which place someone that I would call a classic populist of the right at the top or near the top, and a woman that I would call a classic populist of the left at the top or near the top. And the traditional center-right parties and center-left parties way behind. So, Argentina went populist on Sunday, sort of Brazil a year ago, sort of Mexico a year ago. Could Chile be next? I'm hoping not, but it is something that we have to keep on our radar screen. I'll be happy to talk more about Chile, but I don't want to bore you with that.
Well, lots to talk about in terms of populist trends. So I'll collect questions from the audience, starting with the lady over there. Maybe I'll take a couple at a time.
So are you saying that income inequality doesn't quite tell us the whole story, and that there is a space for, additional explanations such as identity? Or are you saying that identity is more important than the issue of income inequality? And are you also not, in a way, oversimplifying the issue by perhaps, saying earlier that populism is undemocratic and also that they're narrow-focused? Are you saying that other parties don't do that?
Let's see. There are about.
Do you think
sure.
we should, because since for time, so I'll take, since we've just had one from sort of the right wing, we'll take one from the left block here. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. My name's Danny, and I'm a DPhil student in politics. The government in Denmark right now is taking a lot of heat, and it has been for the last several weeks, for example. They have been talking, it's a center-left government. Center-left parties have been talking about restricting immigration. And there's some good evidence refuting this Norris, Yasha Monk kind of thesis that people like welfare benefits when the other person speaks the same language as them, for example, that there is a homophily impact on this, right? But many people would say that restricting immigration or enforcing national language standards or things like this are racist, that they are not inclusive. Is there a way to create a shared identity without focusing on some kind of commonality, whether that's language or whether that is national identity of some kind or voting rights, citizenship, passports, that kind of thing? Can you make an inclusive identity that has no boundaries? Thanks very much.
Very good questions, both of them. Shall I go for it? Okay. Let's see. On the right here, or on the left, I don't know. These things are confusing. There were about 5 sub-questions packed into your question. Very good questions, so let me try to unpack them. Was I saying that inequality was not part of the equation, a big part of the equation, a small part of the equation? I'm going to give you a wimpy answer. It all depends. Probably a bigger part of the equation in Chile than in Denmark. But I was cautioning against applying a story and a sort of a causal account, which is A, very mechanistic, and B, plain wrong for a number of countries. I could give you a list of at least half a dozen countries which have had big populist episodes in which the income distribution has not worsened. In fact, it's gotten better over the last 2 decades. Let me be academic for a minute. I'm no econometrician, but I have taught econometrics courses in my life. If you want to explain some variable which you put on the left-hand side of your statistical exercise, and this was moving a lot Well, something on the right has to be moving a lot, right? Because to explain a big change here, you need to explain a big change there. And what you see in a lot of these countries is that income distribution is either, I'm not talking about the US, I'm not talking about the UK, I'm talking about the emerging markets. In many of the emerging markets, unlike the US and unlike the UK, income distribution has been improving. Income distribution has been improving. If you look at, there's a vast literature pioneered by a woman called Nur Laiq about Latin America. In Brazil, in Mexico, in Peru, in Venezuela, no, sorry, not Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Chile, over the last 10, 15 years, income distribution has been improving. In some countries, a lot. In some countries, very little. So the mechanistic account that says this rose because this rose, statistically, it is wrong. So we need a more nuanced account. Maybe you didn't need it to rise. It was enough for it to be high already, and then some other triggers, whether political or cultural, came in. I mean, if we're really going to take this seriously, repeating the mantra, I don't think is going to get us there. On whether populism is democratic or is not democratic, I was careful with my words. I didn't say that all populists were authoritarian. No. Some populists, by my definition, do not, sort of fulfill category 1 and 2, but don't necessarily go to 3. So they have, some of the ingredients that potentially would make them authoritarian, but don't necessarily go there. But as I look at AMLO in Mexico today, or if I look certainly at Orban in Hungary, or if I look at Duterte in the Philippines, there's no question that there is, in some cases, a nascent authoritarian and anti-democratic stream, and in other cases, as in Venezuela, an outright dictatorship, which is abusing human rights, right or left. So again, it's a matter of degree, but I am fairly comfortable with the notion that populism has the seeds of a very anti-democratic thing, and those seeds often, not always, grow into a big and ugly plant, and we have to therefore be careful. Question over here. Can you have a shared identity which is based on something other than the color of my skin, or the language I speak, or the passport that I carry? It's a really good, hard question. Many of us have struggled with it long and hard. Let me provide 2 answers. I mean, my answer is yes. It's a tentative yes, because it's hard. But I think there are two ways of tackling it. If Paul Collier were in the audience, you may have read his recent book, Paul would reply, and I'm going to steal his answer, that the first commonality is place. Place. We may be of different races, of different religions, we may speak different languages, but we often share a common geography. We live in the same place. And part of the rise of populism in the world has to do with society's neglect of certain places that were left behind. And I think there's I'm not sure exactly where you go from that, but there's a very powerful idea there. In the end, what makes you share identity with the other person who speaks a different language is that in the end, you sort of send your kids to the same school, or maybe you're to a different school, but you walk the same street on the way to school, right? I think there's a powerful idea there. I think there's some room to think about policies of place, not necessarily at the national level, maybe at the regional level or at the local level, in which you create commonalities, in which people feel that they are part of a common enterprise because they're sweeping the streets together, or improving the schools together, whether they be Muslim schools or Hindu schools or Jewish schools or Christian schools. The other answer, and this is more abstract, but I happen to believe it, and this is Martha Nussbaum's answer, if you want, is that, this is Habermas's answer also, when he talked about constitutional patriotism in Germany, is that what we share is a set of values. And those values can be shared by us because there are values that make us part of the same community. If the value of fascism, that's not going to do the trick, right? But if the value is inclusion, if the value is respect, if the value is democracy, if the value is tolerance, we can share those values. Now, the hard part is to make those values concrete. That is to say, to make them into something which I don't simply hear about in philosophy class, but which I can see embodied in daily life. And this takes me back to my point about political leadership. What great politicians do is they create the rituals and the symbols and the attitudes and the language which embody those values in something concrete. And that's why Mandela was such a genius, and that's why Gandhi was such a genius, and that's why Lincoln was such a genius, right? Obama too. And these are, politicians that were very deliberate in how they dressed, what rugby games they went to, what jerseys they put on, whom they embraced and whom they didn't, because they created rituals that brought these values down to earth. Can it be done? Yes. I mean, I think Gandhi did it. I think Mandela did it. Of course, this is a plant that you need to water every day, right? Mandela did his bit 20 years ago that, that has to be renewed. But I think that, again, that's a very powerful idea there. And great political leaders do it. Problem is, we're not great political leaders, at least not all the time.
Over there.
Just wondering.
A little louder, please.
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, when you were talking about inequality maybe not being the primary cause of populism, what I was wondering is if it's maybe higher expectations, which might partly be a positive thing. People have higher expectations for their lives, but obviously if your expectations are higher, they're more likely to be thwarted. Or in the kind of maudlin expression, it's not the despair that gets you in the end, it's the hope. So I was just wondering what your response to that might be.
Is there anybody from the silent middle? Yeah, the gentleman in the back.
In the silent middle, yes.
Hi. I was interested to hear your points around the sort of destruction of checks and balances with populist powers. Arguably in the UK, you could say that rather than being destroyed, some of our checks and balances, notably the media, have been strengthened and in fact mobilised for populist purposes. Do you have any sort of response to that and what perhaps we could be doing to make sure that our checks and balances are actually doing what they're meant to be doing?
All right, expectations. Are dashed expectations playing a part? Yes, probably. There's a long literature in political science, which I'm going to quote with all due respect to the political scientists in the room, that dates back to modernization theory in the 1950s and 60s that says quick growth, quick development, quick modernization brings along with it lots of tensions and lots of contradictions. And often modernization gives you goodies, you're wealthier, you're more prosperous, but gives you political conflict. One of those contradictions is dashed expectations. I don't want to, I'm not an academic fan of that literature, and there are reasons why you might not necessarily think it's the best account of the world, but I think at that level of generality, there's some truth to that. Now, at the risk of that sounding too abstract, let me give you an example from Chile that will make it more terrestrial. Somebody could say, well, the Chilean elite has always been elitist, and the Chilean class structure has been around since, 1541, when, the Spanish got off the boat and landed in what is today Chile. So, what is new? Why is it blowing up today when this tremendous injustice has been around for 500 years? And I think one answer to that is this. Tertiary education in Chile expanded massively over the last generation. We went from about 10% of each cohort to about 50% of each cohort going to university. That is a massive developmental success. There are very few countries in the world which in the course of one generation have gone to 10, 12% to nearly half of every generation, every cohort going to university. And as a result, you can say, okay, well, Chile moved forward, diversified, etc. What's the problem? That, of course, gives rise to tremendous expectations because, if you've got a university degree, you are a different kind of person. At least that's what, traditional culture, whether in the UK or the US or Chile, led you to believe. But there are two difficulties. One difficulty is, I'm going to be an economist here for a minute. When the supply of skilled labor grows very quickly and the demand for skilled labor grows rather slowly, the relative wage of skilled labor falls. In plain English, that means that a lot of people who went to the university expecting a very, very high premium because they had a university degree are finding that premium is coming down very quickly because there are more of them. Of course, if you say this to a recent college graduate in Chile, he or she will probably, come at you with a baseball bat, and they should, but there's some truth to this underlying economics. In addition, you run into the problem I mentioned in passing earlier. In a very discriminatory labor market, in a society with a lot of prejudices, people will want to know whether you went to the right Catholic high school, not whether you got very good grades in university. So the frustration, the gap between what you came to hope, because now you have a university degree, and the reality of the kinds of jobs you can get, and the kinds of opportunities you in fact have, that clash is very powerful. And one way out of that clash is populism, whether left-wing populism or right-wing populism. An amusing, sad, and painful anecdote to illustrate all of that, an audio recording leaked last week in Chile of the president's wife, who described the looting as an alien invasion. When the wife of the leader of a country regards fellow citizens as aliens, you have a problem. Now, Chileans have a sense of humor, so now people parading down the street are wearing alien costumes, and they're carrying signs that say, "We're coming to get you." You can take it lightheartedly, but this reality of discrimination and frustration is very, very powerful. And I think you can read it in a hopeful way. Well, there's the opportunity for change, or you can read it in a less hopeful way. Here is exactly the sort of thing upon which populists feed. And we'll see which one of the two is the one that prevails.
Actually, what you're saying resonates with what I saw in Egypt and Tunisia just after the Arab uprisings, where there was this crisis of expectations as well. And so many, I think, some of the highest levels of unemployment were amongst the most educated group. And again, the response there, I mean, it's sort of so much has happened since, but a friend of mine was invited to tea, an American diplomat, with Mrs. Mubarak as the protests were taking place in the early days. And she said, "Oh, it's just kids holding up traffic, it'll pass." And of course, the regime, yes, fell.
Yeah.
But to go back to questions.
She had a question right here.
Yes, go ahead. And would you like to just also introduce yourself briefly? Of course.
Microphone's coming.
My name is Karen. I'm from Ecuador. So I was wondering about the relationship that you may find between populism and corruption. It seems that in most of Latin American countries, there is a relation. And understanding corruption as the absence of values when you are governing, and also understand it as the lack of values that a country may have. Would a populist get some advantages of how the lack of ethics in the private sector and in the public sector? And is this condition of lack of ethics in our life maybe helping populists rise to power? Is there a relationship here that we need to explore?
Go ahead. There's a lady right there.
Good afternoon. I'm Kaushalya from India. I really like the solution of forging a common shared identity. It's also what many people are writing about nowadays. But I would like to know, how would you like to go about this, especially in the context of social media and internet, where algorithms usually are pushing people into their silos, into echo chambers. So how can we actually get out of the divisive internet and actually leverage that for having this shared identity? Thank you.
So corruption and Facebook, or Facebook and associates. Corruption clearly is behind the devaluation of the legitimacy of elites around the world. I think there's no question about it. And if you look at polling data, this is there, and it's there not only regarding politicians, it's there regarding business elites, labor elites, even religious elites, right? So my first answer is yes, yes, yes. But let me dig a little bit deeper. There are two things that we have to keep in mind before we conclude that we fix that and we fix everything. Complication number one is that the tolerance of voters for corrupt politicians varies massively over time. Argentina had a peronist government until 2015, which, how can I put this politely, was not a paragon of decency. You know, you can go on YouTube and find amazing footage of the man who was the Minister of Public Works hopping over a wall into a monastery, carrying a sack with 7 million euros in cash, which is going to stash behind the altar. You know, it's pretty amazing footage, right? I was in government in Chile at the time. We had to deal with these people, so I know some of these characters. Well, exactly that same coalition, exactly that same bunch of people was reelected by an overwhelming majority in Argentina 2 days ago. So, you know, Albert Hirschman had this beautiful essay called The Changing Tolerance for Income Inequality in the Course of Development. Somebody ought to write an essay called The Changing Tolerance for Corruption in the Course of Political Life. Why that happens, I'm not altogether sure, but it is there. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that corruption is a terrible thing and we should fight it with all our might. It has very different consequences in very different countries at very different times. Let me bore you with an anecdote for a minute. When I was at Harvard, you know, I'm sure Oxford does the same thing. You know, faculty members are deployed when potential donors come to dinner, and you're supposed to say good things about the university. At the time, I was involved with the Latin American Studies Center at Harvard, and one very, 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 very wealthy American potential donor said to me in the course of dinner, this was not, you know, he was not trying to insult me, but he said it with great conviction, I would never invest in Latin America because, you know, those governments are really corrupt. So I said, oh, sir, so where do you invest? And he says, oh, in China, because that's the way you can get things done. You know, I happened to be carrying in my briefcase that day the Transparency International Index of Corruption. It turns out that China, in fact, does much worse than most of the countries in Latin America. Not all of them, but most of them. So exactly why do you view it as a problem? When do you view it as a problem? And what are the factors that lead you to believe that it is less of a problem? I think it's also a big messy issue. The other question was, I'm about to forget, Facebook. Yes, of course. Yes, you asked a question which is great, and I will plead guilty to not having found the answer yet. Let me just reiterate the question because it's very important. It is not simply Facebook, parenthetically. It is technology more broadly. It has caused us all to retreat into our own informational silos. This is, of course, not only related to politics, it's related to all kinds of things. You know, before we had on-demand music in Spotify, and before we had CDs even, I'm old enough to remember a world, without Spotify and without CDs. You had to go to the local concert hall if you wanted to listen to violin, right? And when you went to the concert hall, you met other people who also liked violin or cello music. And as a result, there was a lot of social interaction that went along with your liking of music. Our consumption of music has been privatized, not simply because of Facebook, but because of all the other technological advances of the last 30 and 40 years. This process reaches an apex when it comes to politics, of course, because before when I was little, there were 3 television stations and maybe 10 radio stations. Today, there are hundreds or millions, and I can pick the one, or the right internet newspaper, or the right, website, or the right Twitter feed that will give me precisely what I want to hear. So you get these certain cycles of reinforcement. I have a set of beliefs, and I listen to people who reinforce that set of beliefs. There's an academic literature on this. I quote this guy, Ditela, who's at Harvard. He's been writing a lot about this. There are a million other people writing about this. What do you do about it? It's not altogether clear, although let me just say one thing. It is true that we all seek information from these individual sources, but the degree to which we do varies with the political cycle. When you get closer to things like national elections, the main news media takes on a bigger role, and there may be opportunities there. I think we're also beginning to see movements for things like fact-checking, and therefore, some sort of limit placed on the kinds of, stupidities and atrocities that get spread through social media. I'll put in a little plug for my employer, the LSE. We had a big commission last year called Trust, Truth, and Technology that tried to come up with standards which could be self-policing by institutions like Facebook, and which would tend to alleviate this problem. But I'm using the word alleviate, not the phrase do away with, because I'm not sure we can do away with them. So my conclusion is somewhat pessimistic, but more than anything else, somewhat ignorant. I think we have a lot more thinking to do in this respect.
Okay, so I actually see that we've got 4 minutes, so I'm going to do what I think people do when they're panicking, which is swing to the extreme right. And then...
A worldwide phenomenon.
Yes, and then sort of aim for some equilibrium and get maybe one question from the middle. So I think there were 2 people here on the right. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm Sukrat Manwana from Pakistan. It was a wonderful talk, and you remind me of this Francis Fukuyama's book, Identity, in which he said that it is very difficult to now dispel the silo identity, as she pointed out, from taking hold of the populist masses. So, how do you propose, in practical terms, how can we actually invoke, or how can we actually lay it in practical terms the identity for dignified human experience that you're referring to? How can you actually implement that identity, the concept of identity?
Thank you very much. I'm Tatsuya from Japan. I have read an article of The Economist that points out cynicism being a cause of one of the causes of the emerging populism, and the populism politicians are exploiting the cynicism among the population. And I was wondering to what extent you would agree to this view that people's distrust towards the traditional politics being a factor of the emerging populism.
Okay, so I've actually found a way to balance out and to close with Ngaire in red.
Okay. So the right gets the last word.
No, the left.
The geographical rights.
Oh, but red gets the last.
Yeah, and Andrés, you started today with the photographs and said, what do these people have in common? And I wonder if some of the debates that you've rightly sort of taken us through and criticized are obscuring what the problem is. Because the one thing those leaders have in common is they want to use power without restraint. They want to release themselves from the shackles of whether they're democratic or otherwise. They want more executive power. And what populism is doing is giving them a chance to legitimate that by saying, I can use power without any restraint because I am really the one that represents the people. And so I wonder if instead of trying to fix all the problems in the hope that this will somehow restrain these leaders, what we should be thinking about, taking your argument to its logical conclusion, is what are the new kinds of ways that we can constrain political leaders who have this urge for executive power, who don't want to be shackled by elections, courts, parliaments, but who we need to restrain because we know unrestrained power is so dangerous to each of us. So just a question, should we be thinking about new ways to restrain politicians?
All right. I feel bad because there are a few people who had been holding their hands up for a long time, but I guess, I will not take the blame for that. The gentleman from Pakistan, how do we do this in practice? Let me give you an answer which is going to sound somewhat evasive or maybe downright wimpy, but which has the advantage of being right, I think. If I were to stand here and say the way you create that shared identity in Pakistan is this, and that is the same mechanism by which you can do it in Ecuador or in India or in Canada, I would be saying something really stupid. Because while I would like to think that there's, at a very abstract level, a shared of universal, some shared universal values, respect, dignity, freedom, etc., the shape and the symbols and the expressions that those take in Pakistan may be different than in Ecuador. Surely they are different. So my answer is this is where the academics leave the room and where the politicians come in. And the genius of a politician is precisely to do this, to be able to read the history of your country, to be able to read the culture of your country and to say these are the 3 or 4 things that will bring people together, maybe in mild opposition to the people around us. The nation state will always appeal to, nationalism blight, meaning, there are other countries around us and we're better than these other people, maybe because we beat them at football, maybe for other reasons. But the key is that those values around which you build that are good human values and not exclusive nasty values. But the actual couching has to be very much local. That was a problem with Habermas's formulation of constitutional patriotism in Germany, that it was lovely, but it was way too abstract. I heard Gillian Tett, the FT US correspondent, recently say something which I thought was very good. She said, the problem of the euro is the bank notes. And I said, what do you mean? This was at a talk in the US recently. She said, in every country that I know of, actual bills, actual bank notes, have people on them, right? Liberators, national heroes, great poets, great musicians, great philosophers. If you have a euro in your pocket, which you may, have a look at it. It has no human beings on it. It has buildings on it. Not only does it have buildings, it has fantastic buildings. They don't exist because Europeans couldn't agree whether it should be a French building or a German building. So in fact, they invented a bunch of abstract buildings they put in their notes. So that's quite extraordinary. That's exactly the way not to do it. Okay, so I'm replying negative to you to your question. This cannot be abstract. It has to be very much concrete, in the flesh. Cynicism, the gentleman from Japan. Yes, indeed, I think cynicism is another way of labeling this widespread disenchantment with elites. And I think cynicism is a good label because it suggests not only that these guys are no good, it also suggests that I'm cynical about the prospect of their doing something important for the common good. Which takes us back to the earlier question of dashed expectations. If I'm downcast about the decency and honesty and ability of my politicians, I'm going to be cynical about their potential for improvement, and as a result, I am going to be quite vulnerable to the clarion call of some populist who says, let's go burn some buses because that's a way to make things better. So you're absolutely right. That's very much on the equation. Now, Ngaire's question is a very good one, but I'm going to disagree with her in the following sense. Yes, all populists want more power. But not all people who want more power are populists. General Pinochet in Chile wanted more power, but he wasn't a populist. He was an outright dictator. A guy with guns and concentration camps and bloodshed. What's so particular about these people, and what makes them in some sense so dangerous, is that there are no concentration camps in any of these countries, and there are no troops on the street. And there are no massive human rights violations, except in Venezuela. So these are people who, in the end up trampling upon democratic freedoms, but they get there by means of democratic procedure. And so if you think the way to curtail populism is to say, well, at the very end, I will put more checks and balances so that you cannot, take over the state, yeah, maybe that would have, had those checks and balances been there in the place of Venezuela, maybe, Venezuela would have gone 3/4 of the way toward dictatorship, but not 100% of the way, which it did. Does that do away with the root problem? I'm afraid not. Precisely because populist politicians are so good at using democratic means for advancing their power, often in ways which, at least in the beginning, are not an outright contradiction to the spirit of democracy. I mean, think of, we haven't talked about the UK, and I'm certainly no UK expert, but, was the prorogation of Parliament democratic or not? I'm sure that we had a poll in this room, many people would say yes, many people would say no. Parenthetically, I'm the child of 2 law professors who always told me that there was something good in the continental tradition of writing things down, as in having a constitution, right? I was schooled in an English school, so I always told them, no, the British system is better. I think one thing we have learned is that not having a constitution in writing may make it particularly easy for populism to make inroads. That is not a very general proposition because UK is very unlike in any other country in that respect. But so to get back to Ngaire, yes, I'm perfectly happy to think about more checks and balances. I just worry that they may kick in too late, or that I just worry that some of the populists may be really good at getting around those checks and balances. So that's probably part of the solution, but perhaps not the complete solution.
So, Andres, your thoughts on populism have clearly been very popular, and I'm sorry that I'm the one who has to serve as sort of a check and balance in this case in terms of time. But just to say thank you so very much for coming, and thank you to Ngaire, and thank you to all of you for coming.